In this episode, we shift from the familiar world of standard Linux permissions into a security layer that many beginners find intimidating at first, not because it is random, but because it adds a second rule system that can override what you thought you understood. That extra layer is Security Enhanced Linux, SELinux. And the moment it clicks is the moment you realize it is not trying to replace file permissions, but to add mandatory rules that keep services in their lanes even when traditional permissions are too permissive or when something goes wrong. This matters because Linux systems are full of network-facing services, and those services are attractive targets. So the best defense is often to assume something might get abused and then limit what damage is possible. In the same spirit, secure access is not only about SELinux, because remote login paths like Secure Shell, SSH, are common entry points, and tools like fail2ban are often used to reduce brute force noise and enforce basic guardrails. By the end, you should be able to explain contexts and booleans in SELinux at a beginner level. Connect that thinking to SSHD hardening, and understand what fail2ban is trying to accomplish without turning the topic into a pile of commands. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good way to begin is to contrast discretionary access control, DAC, with mandatory access control, MAC, because that contrast explains why SELinux exists. With DAC, the owner of a file or resource can often decide who else can access it by setting permissions, and the system largely respects those decisions. That is flexible and convenient, but it also means a mistake, a misconfiguration, or a compromised account can open doors wider than intended. With MAC, there is a centrally enforced policy that even privileged users and processes are expected to obey, which makes it harder for a compromised service to break out of its intended role. SELinux is a widely used MAC implementation on Linux, and its goal is to restrict processes and resources based on policy, not only based on ownership and mode bits. The practical implication is that a process might have file permission to read something, but still be blocked by SELinux if the policy says that process type should not touch that resource type. That is why beginners sometimes say everything looks correct, but it still fails, because they are only looking at DAC and not at the additional mandatory policy. The core building block in SELinux is the concept of labeling, where objects and processes receive security labels, commonly referred to as contexts. A context is a structured label that includes information that helps the policy decide what is allowed, and the policy uses those labels to control how processes can interact with files, ports, and other resources. The simplest mental model is to imagine that every file has a tag that describes what it is for, and every running service has a tag that describes what role it is supposed to play. The policy then says, a service with this role tag may read files with that content tag, may write to these locations, and may use these network resources, but nothing else. If a file that belongs to a web service is mislabeled, the web service may be blocked even if the file permissions are open, because the label says it is not web content. Conversely, if a service is compromised, the attacker cannot automatically use it to read sensitive system files, because the service process label is not allowed to touch those file labels even if root-like permissions are somehow obtained. That is the containment promise that makes SELinux valuable. It is also important to understand that SELinux is not a single binary switch between secure and insecure, because it has modes that affect how it behaves. In enforcing mode, policy decisions are actively enforced, meaning prohibited actions are blocked, and those denials typically generate logs that help explain what happened. In permissive mode, policy decisions are logged but not enforced, which allows systems to run while still recording what would have been blocked, and that can be useful for testing and diagnosing. There is also a disabled state where SELinux is not active at all, which removes the MAC layer but also removes the protections it provides. Beginners sometimes respond to a denial by disabling SELinux entirely, but that is similar to turning off a smoke detector because it is loud. A better mindset is to treat denials as signals that a label is wrong, a policy expectation is not being met, or a service is behaving in an unexpected way that might actually be dangerous. The exam-friendly point is that understanding these modes helps you explain why behavior changes across systems and why logs can show denials even when things still appear to work. SELinux booleans are another key beginner concept because they provide controlled toggles that adjust policy behavior without rewriting the whole policy. You can think of a boolean as a policy feature flag that enables or disables certain categories of actions that might be optional depending on how you run your services. For example, you might want a web service to be allowed to connect to the network in some environments, but not in others. Or you might want certain types of file access to be permitted only when you have a specific use case. The important point is that booleans are designed to support secure flexibility, meaning you can expand capability in a specific, audited way rather than loosening everything. That makes them safer than broad permission changes, because they tend to be more targeted and aligned with established policy patterns. For a beginner, the main lesson is not the names of particular booleans, but the idea that policy can be adjusted with defined switches, and that the best fixes usually involve aligning labels and toggles with intent instead of weakening the system overall. When SELinux blocks something, it often looks like a normal permission problem on the surface, so a useful troubleshooting approach is to ask which control layer is responsible for the denial. If a process cannot read a file, you first confirm the classic pieces like ownership and mode bits, because those are still in play and still matter. If those look correct and the failure persists, you then consider whether the file has the correct security context and whether the process is running under the expected context. Denial logs often show the source context, the target context, and the type of access that was attempted, which is a clue about what policy rule is being triggered. Beginners do not need to become policy writers, but they do need to recognize that SELinux denials are not random errors. They are structured decisions. Once you accept that, the goal becomes to reconcile the system's labels with the policy expectations, which often means correcting contexts on files or confirming that a service is not attempting something it should not. This is a calmer, safer posture than disabling protections, because it treats security as part of system correctness. Now we can connect this to secure access through SSH, because SSH is one of the most common remote administration paths into Linux systems. Secure Shell, SSH, provides encrypted remote login and remote command execution capabilities, and it is often exposed to internal networks, management networks, or sometimes the public internet. That exposure makes it a target for password guessing, credential stuffing, and general reconnaissance. So hardening is about reducing unnecessary risk while keeping legitimate access reliable. One beginner-friendly hardening idea is to reduce who can attempt to log in by limiting which accounts are allowed and by avoiding direct route login over SSH. Another is to prefer stronger authentication methods and to remove weak or unused paths, such as disabling password authentication in environments where key-based authentication is feasible. There are also hygiene practices like using non-default ports in some scenarios, not as a primary defense, but as a noise reduction technique that can reduce automated scanning attention. The bigger concept is that remote access should be deliberate, minimal, and monitored, and those principles align with what SELinux is doing at the process level. SSHD hardening also involves understanding the difference between making access inconvenient for attackers and making access fragile for legitimate users. If you lock down too aggressively without a plan, you can accidentally cut off your own access and create an outage. The safe way to think about hardening is to start with clear access requirements, like which users need access, from where, and for what kind of tasks. Then you apply controls that enforce those requirements, such as limiting allowed users, tightening authentication, and ensuring that accounts used for remote access are not overly privileged by default. You also want to ensure the system is logging authentication activity so you can spot unusual patterns, because no hardening is perfect and visibility is part of defense. This is the same pattern we saw with permissions and with SELinux, where you aim for least privilege and clear policy rather than blanket openness. For Linux Plus learners, the emphasis is on understanding what these controls are trying to protect against, not on memorizing a specific configuration line. Fail2ban fits naturally into this story because it addresses a common real-world problem: repeated failed login attempts that can fill logs, waste resources, and eventually succeed if passwords are weak. At a high level, fail2ban watches log files for patterns that indicate abuse, like many failed authentication attempts from the same source, and then takes action to temporarily block that source. The key word is temporarily, because the goal is often to slow down or discourage automated attacks, not to build a permanent access control list by itself. This makes fail2ban a guardrail, not a full security strategy, and it works best when combined with strong authentication and sensible account policy. For beginners, the main idea is that fail2ban is reactive based on observed behavior, which means it depends on correct logging and correct pattern detection. If logs are missing, rotated unexpectedly, or formatted differently, fail2ban may not detect the behavior you expect, which can lead to false confidence. When you understand that dependency, you can treat fail2ban as one layer in a layered defense rather than a single magic fix. It is also helpful to see how these themes interact, because real security is rarely one control acting alone. If SSH is hardened to limit who can log in and how, you reduce the attack surface and the likelihood of compromise. If fail2ban is tuned sensibly, you reduce brute force pressure and reduce log noise, which improves signal for monitoring. If SELinux is enforcing, even if an attacker finds a way into a service or abuses a misconfiguration, the mandatory policy can limit what that compromised process can touch, which reduces blast radius. The common thread is containment, where each layer assumes the layer above might fail and still aims to keep the system safe. This layered thinking is exactly what beginners need, because it moves them away from the unrealistic hope of a perfect single defense and toward a resilient system design mindset. It also explains why disabling one layer to fix a short-term issue can create long-term fragility. A common misconception about SELinux is that it is only for high-security environments and therefore can be ignored for general Linux knowledge. In reality, SELinux is often enabled by default on many distributions, and it affects the everyday behavior of services, especially when you customize file locations or deploy applications in non-standard paths. That means even a small Linux environment can run into SELinux denials, and understanding contexts and booleans helps you respond intelligently instead of disabling protection. Another misconception is that SELinux is the same thing as a firewall, because both can block actions, but they operate at different layers. Firewalls focus on network traffic decisions, while SELinux focuses on what processes can do with resources, including but not limited to network use. When you keep those distinctions clear, you can reason about why something is blocked and choose the correct control to adjust. That clarity reduces the urge to apply random changes, which is one of the biggest sources of security drift over time. If you want a practical troubleshooting frame that does not rely on typing commands, you can describe it as a sequence of questions that follow the layered model. First, confirm the basic goal, like what service is supposed to access what resource or what user is supposed to log in from where. Next, confirm the classic permissions side, because DAC issues are still common and still the simplest to fix. Then, consider whether SELinux policy is relevant, which is likely when traditional permissions look correct but access is denied, and use denial evidence to point toward contexts or booleans rather than guessing. In parallel, for remote access issues, consider whether the lockout is due to authentication policy, due to network filtering, or due to a reactive block like fail2ban that triggered after repeated failures. The point is not to memorize a checklist, but to think in layers and to let symptoms guide you to the right layer. That habit is what keeps troubleshooting disciplined and keeps security controls from being disabled out of frustration. By bringing these ideas together, you can see SELinux contexts and booleans as a way to encode least privilege at the process level, giving the system a strong containment model even when traditional permissions are imperfect. SSHD hardening is about controlling one of the most common entry points by tightening authentication and limiting who can attempt access in the first place. Fail2ban is an additional guardrail that responds to abusive patterns by temporarily blocking repeat offenders, which reduces brute force pressure and improves operational clarity. None of these is a complete solution alone, but together they form a layered approach that is more resilient than any single control. For Linux Plus learners, the important achievement is being able to explain why a system might deny access even when file permissions look open, why remote login settings can drastically change risk, and why reactive blocking should be treated as a supplement rather than a substitute for strong authentication. Once you can explain the intent behind each layer, the details become easier to learn and the system becomes something you can reason about with confidence.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.